Hi, I'm Richard Niles. Over the years, I've had so many messages about these radio shows I did for the BBC back in 2005. Some of the greatest musicians, people like Pat Metheny, Randy Brecker, and Michael McDonald, not only explaining their process, but I got them to demonstrate their concepts on their instruments. I'm really glad to be able to bring you these shows, and if you enjoy them, check out my books shown here. Okay, enough of this shameless plug. Let's start the show with my theme song for Inside Improvisation.
Inside Improvisation. Inside Improvisation with Richard Niles.
What you say? I'm Richard Niles? Then this must be the last part of Inside Improvisation, the only program to explain where musicians come up with all those crazy notes. You're listening to the delicious music of the delightful Maria Schneider, one of the world's most respected jazz composers and a very hip dudess. But hey, Rich, I hear you cry, why are you talking about composers when you're supposed to be talking about improvisers? Well, I've already made the point that even composed music is improvised at the moment the composer thinks it up. But composers like Maria are experts at working with creative musicians, inspiring them to new heights of improvisation.
My idea in composing is that I'm trying to create pieces in a way they almost tell a story. And I see the improvisers as actors in that play. I want them to bring something of their own to my story, yet I want to guide them along so that they're in the right direction, but they bring their own idea to it. So it's important that I give something that gives them an emotional context in which to express themselves. In my own group, I really know the players very well. It's happened that, we'll play something for several years, and then one night I say, you know what, I want to try a different instrument, somebody else on this solo, and suddenly the whole thing comes alive in a whole nother way that I never expected. And I realized that to a large degree I typecast people in certain kinds of roles, and that I could really be much more open, and maybe sometimes putting somebody in a position that's almost the opposite of what I would expect, and then see what they might do. The hardest thing for me in writing, my compositions are quite tightly composed, but then they have this element of freedom. And the question for me always is, how do I create a sense of inevitability over a long period of time, yet having this aspect of the unknown in it? The soloist might play something totally different, but they find some perspective. They came up with something new, and it brought something new to my music. That's why I write jazz, because my music is incomplete unless you, as a player, bring something to it, and then it belongs to both of us.
How do you use voicings to create a backdrop for the musicians to improvise over?
Voicing is a vertical structure, all the notes that are happening at the same time. Chords do certain things to you psychologically. There's certain chords that have wider spaces on the bottom, and those feel uplifting. And then there's chords where they have smaller spaces on the bottom, and they kind of press down. So for instance, something that might be uplifting would be this. Because it has these notes on the bottom. Each of these notes have something in between that I'm not playing. So between those two notes is, and between those two notes, so that's a very kind of lifted, open sound. Here's another open sound. So those are wide intervals, then there's a smaller interval, so it's very lifted. Now, there's other kinds of chords that have smaller intervals, or what we call half steps on the bottom. So at the very bottom is that closed down interval. So that creates this kind of dark, brooding sound. So I'm always thinking in context of mood to create the right emotional context for the player. But then there's many other aspects too. There's the aspect of rhythm. There's the aspect of how long a chord endures. If it's a long space and the player has a chance to float in that, or if the chords are moving very tightly and quickly, so it creates an agitation and the soloist almost has to jump through hoops. So there's that sense of excitement. So there's so many different levels and aspects of the music with which you can create emotion underneath a soloist.
Maria Schneider also explained that in the hands of great improvisers, a composition can improvise itself to new areas over the years.
Most of us have worked together almost since 1998, and for 5 years we played every Monday night, so we know each other so well. Each of the players, they were playing their same solo sections, trying to play it different. They're playing in front of all their peers who are listening to what they're playing week after week, so they had to keep stretching themselves. All of a sudden, some new ground would break for them, and it's been wonderful to watch the development of those people over the years. You know, the thing that inspired me to become a musician was when I was 5 years old. My first piano teacher, she moved to my hometown from Chicago, and she had been this really great strident classical pianist, but the first impression I got of her was like in The Wizard of Oz when we go from black and white into color. Her personality shot into the air, that potential for people to illuminate their personality in sound. To me, it's the most magnificent thing, and that's why I'm a musician, and that's why I write for improvisers.
Saxy Chris Hunter has worked with many inspiring composers, including the great Gil Evans, best known for his work with Miles Davis. Unlike the piece you're listening to now, Chris worked with Gil Evans later in his career when there was very little actual writing and total freedom for the musicians.
The period I was really around Gil was one in which he essentially had abandoned formal arranging structure. He was much more into the spontaneous environment. Whatever the players and the moment would generate, anything really was possible. But I think there are a lot of parallels between that and some of the orchestral things he did with Miles Davis. What he was trying to create was a kind of tapestry over which soloists could be themselves. The whole thing really was a very textural experience. It was just complete anarchy at sometimes, you know. But that seems to me to have a lot of parallels in Sketches of Spain, where you have just one immense color behind the soloists, and that is the thing that makes them inspired.
Did you find that enormous freedom inspiring or just kind of annoying?
Well, I definitely enjoyed it, but I also felt that I really hadn't played enough music beforehand. I would have liked to have been in that situation now, formulated a whole level of playing that would deal with the spontaneity of that situation. I mean, one of the most frustrating things, I think, was just not knowing what the hell was going to happen. But he really didn't want to know what was going to happen. He liked the surprise of the moment. People did abuse it. And I mean, but that was also part of the process too. There's some guys who bring several instruments to the band and take a series of solos on each of them, you know.
Composer Bob Belden worked with Miles Davis, a band leader and composer who inspired the creativity of a host of iconic improvisers, including John Coltrane, Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, John McLaughlin, Mike Stern, and John Scofield. Bob gave me an insider's view of the Miles methodology.
There's this beauty of his music in the 70s. It's very difficult for people to understand on one level. There's a movie, Groundhog Day, I'm sure you're familiar with, where Bill Murray wakes up every day. You have a chance to redo the day over and over. Miles Davis wanted to wake up every day and not have a clue what the band was going to sound like that night. So then when he heard it, it was completely new to him and to anybody who heard it, because it didn't exist on Earth prior to that. And so the deeper he got into the band, the more he was just willing to sit there and listen to it evolve. And he would wait for something to happen. And there's an elegance to that which is sadly lacking in jazz today, where you just want it to happen as opposed to making it happen.
So what wild and crazy places will improvisation go in the future? Composer, pianist, and hipster David Chesky has plenty of ideas. His group, The Body Acoustic, combines Latin music with 21st century compositional techniques.
I believe that art has to reflect the time. If you lived in the 20s, they would play stride. But we don't live there. The way we look at the world is different. So I don't go up and say, Richard, how do you do? What's nice? It's like, what's happening, man? And I think that the harmonic language of jazz is sort of stagnant in a way, whereas what I'm trying to do is take the language I use in the classical world and apply that, as in my band, The Body Acoustic, apply this harmonic language to a jazz rhythm. So I have the bass player and drummer playing, and then instead of using this language, we try to use a language more like... and improvise over this. So in my group, I lay down this modern palette of colors. The soloists, Randy Brecker and Bob Mintzer, they're forced to use this palette as a launching point to improvise, and their improvisation has to be different because they can't use the traditional minor and major scales and things like that. Take the harmonic language and stretch it, and then it has to evolve. I feel that young people, 18, 19 years old, need to take this vocabulary and reflect the world they see around them, and also take it and stretch it and take it into the next century.
How did Bob Mintzer and Randy Brecker react to this new palette that you've laid out for them?
Well, they have such a vocabulary that they adapt it instantaneously. The whole thing about art, I mean, you look at Picasso, he was always young because he was inventing himself. Miles Davis, you know, if you look at his evolution, in a short period of time, he evolved so far. I have this philosophy, why do we have to construct melodies and improvisations based around or diminished scales? Why can't it be? When you first hear it, maybe it sounds weird, but after a while, I think it's sort of like eating Thai food, you know? You need a little more spice, and when you go to Bangkok, it's so spicy, you can't handle it, but the locals think it's fine.
Do you see other people going in the kind of direction that you're going in?
It just seems strange to me that I'm older and I'm trying to do new things, and kids 19 are supposed to be doing this. I hear a lot of jazz and a lot of music. Most of it bores me. I've heard it all before, and again, it's just variations on the theme. I think it's important in any art form that art has to reflect the time.
While David Chesky uses compositional disciplines to break new ground, the wacky and wonderful Bob Belden is using some more abstract conceptual ideas to inspire the soloist of the millennium.
I learned how to improvise with a video camera, and how to create music by going down and shooting video and then creating music to that video image. Improvisation isn't just necessarily jazz. When people are arguing, especially when somebody gets caught cheating, that's improvisation at its best. And when children are caught lying, they're improvising. And then you see it in politics. You see them testifying, the cigarettes won't harm anybody, And you see people improvise the majority of their life. There's a thing about improvisation where the traditional thing is you play the melody and adorn the melody and you play it again. And then it got to the point where melodies became fragments, gestures, and then melodies became a set-off point. Then what Miles Davis would do is the whole set would be a composition. It would be an intensity, a relaxation, an intensity, a relaxation in terms of that arc. And then you would have key centers, and you'd have tempo fluctuations. And to the point where, like the late 60s, he was improvising what contemporary classical composers would spend months writing. They were improvising in blocks of sound and a confluence of events, or an abstraction of an idea. Like with Tim Hagen's, our records were basically improvising on musique concrète. The easiest way to explain it is, remember those radio spots where they'd mix 10 or 11 songs right after one another, phrase here, a phrase there. They would create a new song out of 8 songs to just promote some giveaway on the show. So that was a commercial adaptation of musique concrète in the 60s that everybody heard just naturally. And it uses sound as form. So you might have a continuous, like a hum, for 2 minutes, and that's the melody. You might have tape cutting. They cut tapes randomly to create a complete unique effect. And then we got to the point where on the stage we would create other universes with sampling and sound distortion and manipulation. So then your improvisation would be influenced by things you never heard in real life.
In 2005, creative music has a new and dangerous enemy. In the old days, there were many independent record companies run by music-loving entrepreneurs. This gave us creative labels like Atlantic, Verve, and Motown. Now the multinational conglomerates like Universal, BMG, and Warner's have swallowed up all those quirky little indies, and the big boys are signing artists willing to play it decidedly safe. That's my dad, Tony Romano, playing with the godfather of jazz violin, Joe Venuti. Joe began his career in the late 1920s when musicians flourished in a more relaxed environment that appreciated talent. Contemporary jazz violinist Regina Carter sees the tougher challenges that face today's creative musician.
You have to have a soul and it's going to be affected, because if not, then you're a machine. Now, who are you? Then you've gotten lost in that. Who are you? Unfortunately, I think in the music industry, and especially here in the States, for so many years we got so caught up in finding the next so-and-so. And we still see it. You know, Diana Krall came out. She was a big success. So all the record companies were looking for the next Diana Krall. And then it was Nora Jones. What happened to the days of finding an individual and letting them come in and have their own voice and presenting something new and fresh to the world? It always kind of ties into what's going on politically, socially. We've turned into a big TV culture. We want everything fast, and we don't want to have to think for ourselves anymore. So it's very difficult for young people or any people that are coming out with some new music or their own sound. If it doesn't sound like the last 50 things that you've heard, then people aren't so willing to be open and accept it. It's becoming harder and harder even for those that have record deals, and I think the way that the industry has been affected is kind of almost helped musicians now, because the internet is such a big tool that musicians that don't have a record deal, if they have saved the money, can do a record and put it out there and make all that money back themselves.
You're listening to Pat Metheny's new epic CD, The Way Up. Pat is also acutely aware of the challenges for the future and the dangers in the present.
The challenges for anybody that's starting now are exactly the same as they were for anybody, with the additional burden of each additional decade of new information and innovation and everything that they are also required to absorb or ignore. It's not easy. The thing that I think we see a lot of now are younger players who are very capable musicians, more than capable, exceptional, and who finally get to the point of fluency without necessarily having much of a story to tell of their own. I have the feeling sometimes, especially when I hear a lot of young saxophone players, it's sort of like that feeling of like you've got 500 channels on your cable TV, but there's really nothing to watch. You know, there's a lot of stuff, but in terms of somebody who can sort of crystallize the feeling of their generation and of a time into a language that's unique and their own, and at the same time is addressing all of the stuff that they rightly spent 8 or 10 years shedding in high school and college. It's odd to me that there haven't been more guys who have managed to jump that hurdle. I also have to say that on a political level, it's become less of a goal, because politically we do live in an era that it also affects the jazz world of sort of fundamentalism versus modernism. I mean, that's kind of the general conflict in the world. And in the jazz world, the fundamentalist movement is significant. And that movement makes a case that it's okay to sound like Coleman Hawkins. And if you do it great, that's enough. That's a break from the jazz tradition. Historically, there haven't been too many examples where a sort of revisionist view of the world has ultimately held sway. I do find it somewhat fascinating, the parallels between what's happening in the jazz world and the general political climate of the world. They really mirror each other in many ways.
Gary Husband is a musician I've admired for many years, not only for his wizardry at the piano, but for his artistry at the drums, immense musical talent. Those aren't my words, they're John McLaughlin's. My words are that Gary's new project, Force Majeure, featuring Randy Brecker on trumpet, Jerry Goodman on violin, and Elliot Mason on trombone, is seriously and humongously hip. I asked him about creating this highly groovy project.
I guess what I wanted to put together by choosing those musicians was, number one, something that would work all together, but I wanted to consider individuals who really haven't pursued a path like the one that I heard in my head. In a sense, it was very much born totally of imagination, just keeping the windows and the doors open in your head and seeing what flies in. I decided on trumpet, trombone, and violin, which was quite an unusual concoction, in a sort of musical setting where they could really stretch. This is what I try to do with Force Majeure, which actually was not overly written. A lot was left to the interpretation of the musicians, and of course, in that there's not a heavy amount of information written, the performance is guaranteed to be different every night.
Well, that's serious stuff, but far more distressing to me is that this is the end of the show and the last of the series. Now, bringing politics and philosophy into a discussion of music may seem a bit over the top to some, but I guess it has to come down to this. Although most of us spend our days concerned with paying the rent and getting through the traffic and working even though we're coming down with the flu, art, music, painting, books, drama, comedy, these things are important to us. As that great improviser Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, we have art so that we shall not die of reality. There are many forms of music, but the reason I've always been fascinated by improvisation is because, like the best of art, it expresses the diversity of human emotion in a constantly changing way. Just as we're all different people, some improvisers are ice blue cool like Paul Desmond, or burning up like Jimi Hendrix, or soulful like Junior Walker, or on an intellectual quest for the new like David Chesky or Bob Belden. Because of their unique approach, some musicians have changed the way we hear music, like Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis, and Pat Metheny. And some just give you a great big smile on your face groove like the Average White Band. In this series, we've seen the old masters and the young lions, the traditionalists and the revolutionaries. Each personality has chosen a different path, and we need all these different approaches, just like we need different foods. Pizza's nice, but isn't it great to have a little cake afterwards? I hope we've shown that becoming a master improviser requires hard work, dedication, and an inquiring mind. It's not just someone moving their fingers around like a maniac on a musical instrument. I also hope that the next time you see someone break into a solo, you'll say, "Yeah, baby, I dig," or even "jolly good." I want to thank all the brilliant musicians who took time out of their busy schedules to whip out their instruments and explain what they do and how and why they do it. I'd also like to thank Mitch Kudley, Yannick Gwizdala, and David Chesky for their help in New York, Lucy Ditchmont, David Morley, and my producer, Anna Harrison, at Unique, the production company. Well, I'm now officially out of work, but I'm still Richard Niles, looking forward some sunny day to taking you on another fascinating, fortuitous flight inside improvisation.